Hello and welcome to the Climate Museum discussion, Black Lives in the Climate Crisis panel. I'm Felicia Chenko, and on behalf of the team at the Climate Museum, we want to thank you for joining us. Before we begin, we have a few ground rules we'd like to cover. Please follow along as we show you some features of Zoom. We highly encourage you to interact with each other. If you'd like to use the chat function, go to the bottom of your screen and click on chat. A box will pop up. In the drop-down menu, you then have an option to select to whom you'd like to send a message to. Reminder to please keep all messages respectful. We don't expect this to come up, but any disrespectful comments will result in the commentary being removed from the Zoom. If you agree what's being said on the panel, show each other by dropping an asterisk snap in the chat. We also highly encourage you to interact with the panelists if you'd like to ask a question. Click Q&A, type in your question, and send. Please post questions throughout the webinar, and we will incorporate them throughout, starting early on. Lastly, if you had any technical issues, feel free to reach out to me, Felicia Chenko, via email, tinycastco@gmail.com. Once again, thank you for joining us. I will now hand it off to Miranda Massey, Director of the Climate Museum. Miranda?
Greetings all, and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Climate Museum and to Black Lives and the Climate Crisis, a conversation we're so grateful and proud to be able to host today. The issues raised by the Black Lives Matter protests and their intersection with the climate crisis are the very most important questions and challenges that we can be discussing together as a whole society today. And we're absolutely bowled over to have been able to bring together these extraordinary speakers you'll be hearing from today, and also at the level of interest that all of you out there have expressed in being part of this conversation. And as Felicia mentioned, we'd like it to be very interactive starting early on, so please send your questions along. We want to lay out some premises, some organizational premises of the Climate Museum at the top to liberate the conversation to get beyond the basics. To quote a recent piece by Hopkins, the carbon economy requires sacrifice zones, and sacrifice zones require racism. So we take it as axiomatic that there are deep and generative and structural links between racism and the climate crisis. That's not, whether that exists or not is not what we're going to be talking about today. We also take it as axiomatic that we need to change the profound structures of our society in order to move forward together on both of these crises and a number of others, because they are so interconnected and so deeply built into our history as a people, as a nation. We've prepared a resources document for you. Many of you received that by email earlier. For those who came in off the wait list, you can go to our blog, which is at climatemuseum.org, for links to both resources on racism and the climate crisis and how they're interconnected, and also just to read more about and by these awesome and amazing speakers you'll be hearing from today. If we were at the Climate Museum, we would be engaging in an exercise where each of you would turn to their neighbor and have a conversation before beginning the panel, or an exercise like that to create an atmosphere of emotional openness, which is so needed in this discussion about societal and personal transformation. We can't really do that on Zoom, but we do have an absolutely brilliant and decorated poet who has agreed kindly to read us a spectacular poem that we think can help create that same frame of mind and heart, that same openness to transformation. Another reason for this poem in particular is that the challenges that we face and the opportunities we face together now, they're about deep structures in the society. They're about deep personal reckoning as well as deep social reckoning. They're about power and struggle, and they're also about love. And so I ask you to welcome Aracelis Jerome in reading "You Are Who I Love" to start this conversation off. Thank you all.
Thank you everybody for being here with us today. And my deep gratitude to all of the speakers. I look forward to hearing you. I'm honored to share this love poem. You are who I love. You, selling roses out of a silver grocery cart. You in the park feeding the pigeons. You cheering for the bees. You with cats in your voice in the morning feeding cats. You protecting the river. You are who I love. Delivering babies, nursing the sick. You with henna on your feet and a gold star in your nose. You taking your medicine, reading the magazines. You looking into the faces of young people as they pass, smiling and saying, all right, which they know it means, I see you, family. I love you. Keep on. You dancing in the kitchen, on the sidewalk, in the subway, waiting for the train because Stevie Wonder, Hector Lavoe, La Lupe. You stirring the pot of beans, you washing your father's feet. You are who I love, reciting Darwish, then June. Feeding your heart, teaching your parents how to do the Dougie, counting to 10, reading your patient's charts. You are who I love. You who, with the seconds of your body, with your time here, arrive on buses, on trains, in cars, by foot, to stand in the January streets against the cool and brutal offices saying, your cruelty does not speak for me. You are who I love, you struggling to see, you struggling to love or find a question. You better than me, you kinder and so blistering with anger. You are who I love, standing in the wind, salvaging the umbrellas, graduating from school, wearing holes in your shoes. You are who I love, weeping or touching the faces of the weeping. You, Violeta Parra, singing toward us in the dream. You, Joseph Jackson, carrying your brother home. You noticing the butterflies, Ayana and Tamir, sharing your water. You who did and did not survive. You who cleaned the kitchens, you who built the railroad tracks and roads, you who replanted the trees, listening to the work of squirrels and birds. You are who I love. You whose blood was taken, whose hands and lives were taken, with or without your saying, yes, I mean to give. You are who I love. You who the borders crossed, you whose fires, you decent with rage, so in love with the earth, you writing poems alongside children, you cactus, water, sparrow, crow, you, my elder, you are who I love, summoning the courage, making the cobbler, getting the blood drawn, sharing the difficult news, you always planting the marigolds, learning to walk, wherever you are, you come to me in dreams. Speak to your children in your mother's languages, tootsing the birds. You are who I love, behind the library desk, leaving who might kill you, crying with the love songs, polishing your shoes, lighting the candles, getting through the first day, despite the whisperers, sniping, fail, fail, fail. You are who I love, you who beat and did not beat the odds, you who knows that any good thing you have is the result of someone else's sacrifice, work, you who fights for reparations, you are who I love, you who stands at the courthouse with the sign that reads, no justice, no peace. You playing drums in the procession, you feeding the chickens and humming as you hem the skirt. You sharpening the pencil, you writing the poem about the loneliness of the astronaut, you wanting to listen, you trying to be so still. You are who I love, mothering the dogs, standing with horses, in brightness and in darkness, throwing your head back as you laugh, kissing your hand. You carrying the berbera from the mill and the jug of oil pressed from the olives of the trees you belong to. You are who I love, crossing the desert and trying to cross the desert. You are who I love, working the shifts to buy books, rice, tomatoes, bathing your children as you listen to the lecture, heating the kitchen with the oven, up early, up late. You are who I love, learning English, learning Spanish, drawing flowers on your hand with a ballpoint pen, taking the bus home. You are who I love, speaking plainly about your pain, sucking your teeth at the airport terminal television every time the politicians say something that offends your sense of decency, of thought, which is often, you are who I love, throwing your hands up in agony or disbelief, shaking your head, arguing back out loud or inside of yourself, holding close your incredulity, which yes, too, I love. I love your working heart, how each of its gestures, tiny or big, stand beside my own agony, building a forest there. You are who I love, in the streets, packing the lunches with the rain on your face, how the tearing it down is a love song. You, at the edges and shores, in the rooms of quiet, in the rooms of shouting, in the airport terminal at the bus station saying no, and each of us looking out from the gorgeous unlikelihood of our lives at all, finding ourselves here, witnesses to each other's tenderness, which this moment is fury, is rage, which this moment is another way of saying, you are who I love. You are who I love. You and you and you are who.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Aracelis. That was a wonderful way to open and a gorgeous recitation of how we're all feeling, I think, in this moment. My name is Maxine Burkett. I am the co-founder and senior advisor of the Institute for Climate and Peace, but I'm also a trustee of the Climate Museum, and I'm so proud to be here with all of you on this panel today. There's been a lot of discussion about the relationship between racial hierarchy and anti-Black racism. And as Miranda has mentioned, we take as a premise that there's not only a relationship, but that the climate crisis would not be possible without treating people and planet as disposable. We're hosting this conversation because there's something different about our ability to discuss Black lives and the climate crisis in this moment. And so what we hope to do in the next just about 90 minutes is have a candid conversation about how we got here, but also where we'd like to go and how we get there. Those are just some of my questions, and I'm sure all of you in the audience have many as well. So I also want to restate that there's a Q&A box. Please ask your questions as soon as they arrive, and we will ask them of the panelists. So I'll introduce our panelists briefly. First, Honoré Archila is the co-executive director of the Center for Popular Democracy. Jerome Foster is, among other things, the founder and executive director of 1MillionOfUs. Kate Marvel is a climate scientist at Columbia University and the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And Jackie Patterson is the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. So I want to dive right in because there's so much that we can talk about with all of you. And my first question relates to this moment. In her most recent New York Times Magazine article, civil rights journalist and 1619 project curator Nicole Hannah-Jones opened with a simple statement: it feels different this time. My question for all the panelists is, how did we get to this moment? And from your vantage point, does it look or feel different this time? So Ana Maria, can I ask you to start us off in this conversation?
Thank you so much, Maxine, for facilitating this conversation. I have to say I am so incredibly moved by the poem. Because at the end of the day, what Aracelis' poem captures so beautifully is that we have not built this country rooted in this idea that we are who we love, that we ought to construct a society and an economy and a democracy that allows people to love freely their children, their parents, their grandparents, their neighbors, and that allows those people we love to live with dignity. So we got here because by building an economy rooted in the exploitation of Black people, building a democracy rooted in the exclusion of most of us. And we have been able to make progress because people have fought back. We have been able to kind of get ever closer to this idea that is written in the documents of this country, but yet to be realized through the struggle of people who have been fighting for the inclusion of all of us in our democracy, in our economy. We have gotten to a moment in history of incredible kind of uprisings and inspiring uprisings in the midst of like profound pain. And that pain, you know, from like generations of exclusion and suffering and violence on the bodies of people of color, on the bodies of women, on the bodies of gender nonconforming people, is accompanied by the exploitation of our planet and the very unequal ways in which we all experience that. And I would say that we are in these moments of incredible upheaval because Black women have led us to kind of a moment of reckoning, have forced us to really stare at the reality of how this country was constructed, how in the midst of a pandemic, the shattering of safety. We know that safety can no longer be defined by the number of military equipment that the Army has or the amount of guns and riot gear that the police has. There is no way that safety can any longer be defined in militaristic terms when over 100,000 people have died because they didn't have access to care, because doctors and nurses and healthcare workers didn't have the equipment and the resources that they needed to care, because there has been massive disinvestment in the things that allow us to care for the people we love. And there has been massive investment in the things that allow the exploitation of the earth, the exploitation of people, and the mechanisms of control of police and military and others that maintain that make that exploitation possible. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. Jerome, I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well, especially on this question of, you know, what feels different in this moment, and someone who's been on the streets probably for your entire life. Does this moment feel different to you?
Yes, I would think that right now is a very different time than in the 60s and 70s. It's a very different time than in 2008. It's a very different time now because of the fact that we're seeing everyone understand the intersectionality between these movements. And we aren't having conversations about, well, how does climate change at all connected to race? We're having these conversations and seeing that this is disproportionately impacting people of color, because if we look in Louisiana or if we look in South Shore of Illinois, we're seeing that they're impacting people. And it's directly as a cause of the placement of fossil fuel placements in their communities. And this feels different because everyone is rising up. Everyone is seeing that we can't just continue talking about this. We can't just continue to have internal conversations talking about, oh, I feel bad about this. We have to go out and actually hold our politicians accountable. And we're having people that are in Congress that are advocating for this. And we're having progressive Democrats actually come out and say that this is real, this is actionable, and we need to enforce what's going on. Because recently, over decades, 95% of Black Americans reports to the EPA have been denied. They've been completely like discrediting their experiences, saying that two injustices can't exist in the same space. That's consistently what's been seen in films, been seen in our culture, is saying that why can't we understand that racism can exist in the same space that climate change is existing in? Like, we're a community, and we have to see that, like, everyone, either if you're white, Asian, Black, Latino, anything, we're seeing that we're all in the same community together, and that we aren't pitting against each other anymore. We're coming together and having our own conversation. We're coming together and forming our own organizations, and we're having conversations like this where everyone's together and we're educating ourselves, and we don't have to rely on a pre-vetted news organization to come and tell us this. We're teaching ourselves, and that's really what's different about it. Is technology, is people coming together, us understanding the intersectionality of it, and us seeing that young people are going to vote, and we're seeing that young people are out here in the streets. And like, this is an election year. We're even more energized because we see that we can have a direct impact. In 2018, we had a major impact in the House, and what we need to do now is have a major impact in 2020 with the Senate and the presidency, because we can't have people that deny science lead our country, because those aren't representatives. If they no longer represent the issues that you care about, and no longer champion the issues that you elected them for, then you shouldn't have them as your elected representatives. You should vote them out and vote a person who really cares about our future, our livelihoods, and our climate, and our torn racial history.
Thank you, Jerome. That's excellent. You know, there's this notion of, especially with the absence of leadership in this moment, that notion of safety is really a question. And I actually, Anna Maria, when you were describing the sort of shattering of safety, that notions of safety, I found that to be so powerful, and actually reminded me of a really vivid memory of the cover of the National Geographic in 1988. I don't know if any of you are my age remember this, but it was a shattered Earth hologram on the cover. And it was actually following what was that year, the first sort of congressional testimony by James Hansen about the climate crisis. So that shattering of safety seems to have this sort of longer thread that we really would love to explore more. And Kate, on that point, but as you know, obviously specifically too on Black lives and the climate crisis, from your vantage point, how did we get here, and does it feel different as a climate scientist for you?
Yeah, so I'm gonna make a confession, which is that I am a nerd, and I'm speaking as a nerd, as a scientist. And as a scientist, one of the things that really annoys me is seeing headlines that say things like, scientists are concerned, or scientists are worried that we might exceed the 1.5 degree threshold, that we might trigger tipping points, that we might melt the West Antarctic ice sheet. And I read those and I think, where the hell do the rest of you live? Like, why are only scientists concerned about this? And I think what's been changing is the narrative. The narrative that climate change is a purely scientific issue and it belongs only in the realm of physics and chemistry. That's not true, and that's never been true. But it's been presented very much as an issue just for scientists to think about or just for scientists to debate. And I think that's been changing lately because there's been this realization that I'm a climate modeler. I can make climate change happen over and over and over again in a climate model. And that's really useful because I can study why it's happening, what it means, what the uncertainties are. But climate change doesn't happen on my computer. Climate change happens in the real world. Climate change happens in the world that we build for it. And so I think what's been changing is the narrative that this is a purely scientific issue, because we've been realizing more and more, at least in the media and in the mainstream conversation, we've been realizing that this is not just an issue for scientists to think about. This is an issue for everybody to think about. And why do I think that's been changing? I think it's been changing because of people like you, honestly. I think it's been changing because there are people who have been making this case for decades now. And it's been changing because of youth activists and this real sort of influx of energy and brilliance and imagination. And so that's why I think it's been changing. And that gives me, if not hope, at least motivation for the future.
Thank you, Kate. I agree. And something about youth activism seems to be able to carry and hold the space for there being multiple assaults on our well-being and our safety at one time, which we've, I think, had a lot of struggle with to date in the popular discourse. And so, Jackie, I know you and I have talked a lot about the synergistic effects, the overlapping burdens on our communities. Can you say something about where you're at in this moment? With the opportunity for progress, the notions of safety, the ability to have these conversations. Where are you at with this?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, just your posing question in terms of what brought us here. I think when we think about this moment of where we are and we think about how we got here, I think to the fact that as Black folks that we got here in the hulls of ships as cargo, and we were separated from our communities, our families, to some and from our what would have been our generational wealth, and we were brought here to be and became the generational wealth of others. And for us, as we kind of fast forward to this moment where people are making bolder demands, and people are coming to a different level of realization of the depth of the problem. I feel some degree amidst the grief and the pain of it. I also feel some glimmers of hope that we are actually recognizing that we can't treat cancer with hydrogen peroxide on the skin, like that there is a rot and a depth to the challenge that requires transformational shifts, that requires total systems change, that requires a different way of thinking, a different sense of what possibilities are. And so for me, I am encouraged by seeing that there are, as was stated earlier, there are people who are, instead of kind of from the years of oppression, communities finding themselves getting beat down to such an extent that people are only asking for what they think they can get from this system that is literally designed against them, to people actually asking for what they have a right for, not just asking, but demanding and seizing what they have a right for, and what we actually want. And so out of that, we're just seeing such amazing glimmers of change. We're seeing, whether it's the whole, not just tweaking of the criminal justice system in Minneapolis, but the whole overhaul, like scrapping what was there and starting over again in terms of what it looks like to develop systems of community safety. We're seeing groups like the Soul Fire Farm in New York, where we're reimagining our relationship with land and food and doing this in a different way. We're seeing groups like the local clean energy folks out in California who are saying we don't have to continue to be subject to a company that is trying to make a profit over the basic need that we have for electricity, and that we can own our own electricity and generate it in resonance with the earth, and still provide for all. We're recognizing that we shouldn't be privatizing water, a resource that everyone needs for life, once again, and have it so that someone can heartlessly flip a switch and separate us from that vital resource. So we're seeing people really rising up and creating the regenerative systems, the systems that are rooted in values of love and community and mutuality. And so that definitely gives me hope that we have the imagination and that we have the innovation to move us in a different direction out of where we've come. So thank you. Thank
you for that, Jackie. I definitely want to dive into that this moment where we see this opportunity to move into something completely different than what we've seen before. There was a question though that came in that I would like to just spend a second, to pause on, which is to say that there has been such an amazing opportunity for our voice to be heard, and for the conversation to get much deeper, like you say, to get to root causes rather than dealing just superficially. But there are some headwinds, right, we have to be mindful of. And the question that we got specifically was about how to maintain the integrity of the ask to be true to the moment of anger and frustration and commitment to possibility, but also recognizing that there is a strong conservative voice and a leadership that might be, well, certainly is an ally in the shared cause or in the shared vision moving forward. So this is for everyone, but certainly on the heels of what you were saying, Jackie, what do we do with those that aren't on board? Right? What does that look like, and does it matter? That's for everyone, but certainly, Jack, if you want to take a stab.
Sure, I can start. Yeah, so as you can imagine, in a number of the communities we work with, particularly in the South and some of the places where we have communities that are in very conservative context and very conservative governments, that the conversation has had to be about where do we find kind of a commonality in our lived truth as local communities. And so folks are able to find common ground around whether it is the basic need for all for water or food or energy. And we don't have to put it in a political context. We just put it in the context of what we need and what are the barriers for what we need, whether it's the right to clean air or clean water or the right to the commons. And so there, when organizing locally, and this is why we have such a strong commitment to localism, because all of the labels of the political economy can start to fall away, because it's about the fact that we are interdependent, and the fact that we want well-being for our families. We want so many of the same basic things. And this is where we see our communities come together around a local agendas and local needs, where again, some of those divisions start to fall away. So that's some of the successes we've started to see, where it just really is all about supporting local folks coming together and coming to an agreement about what they want and moving forward in concert.
Anna Maria, did you have some thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I think I agree completely with Jackie, and also think the Movement for Black Lives has actually offered a very useful framework for this moment of thinking about what we ought to remove investments from and where we ought to demand the collective resources that we have as a society to be put in. So the Invest, Divest framework is a really useful kind of invitation to examine where are we as a society investing? What are we, and what does that say about who we are today and who we want to be? It's an invitation to think about, well, what is it that we actually need? Now that we know the safety is actually, some communities have known this forever. Black communities have known for as long as this country has existed that the police is not there to protect them. That is the case for immigrant communities as well. It is the case for communities of color. But there is a kind of shattering of the definition of the alliance of safety and policing in this moment that is very new and very important, because one of the things that has come to light as we think about kind of the local communities and what local communities can demand of their local governments and can create for each other, there's a kind of deeper realization or more visible realization that local communities are investing incredibly high percentages of their local taxes in policing and other mechanisms, other kind of parts of the system of criminalization. And you look at cities like Baltimore, over 50% of its resources is going to the police department and attached systems, and in a place where people need housing and schools need to be better and transportation must be improved. And so there is this kind of moment where we have a framework that allows us to think about both that as a society. In order to actually seize these moments, we must demand transformations at system levels. And that means we have to demand the moving of resources away from, things that continue to exert violence on people's bodies and on the planet. So think about how to, as the country will rebuild, the economy will eventually kind of heat up again, how to not just double down on the extraction of our planet, but actually build the things that people need, and build systems that are sustainable. So that is a framework that I have found very useful, and that allows people to actually engage with their local governments or decision makers at every level of government in a way that is very powerful.
Thank you. Jerome, Kate, thoughts or responses to Jackie and Anna-Maria? Kate?
I agree completely with what Jackie and Anna-Maria said, but I also want to point out that I feel like a lot of times when the conversation turns to issues of equity and inclusion and justice, a lot of white people say, what can I do? What can I do? And this is an example of something that white people can do. White people who have connections to those communities, white people who know what resonates, white people can take it upon themselves to start these conversations. And I think that is something that we have to keep in mind, that the fact that Black lives are undervalued in this country is not just a Black problem, it's a white problem. And we are the ones who have to take on that responsibility.
Thank you for that, Kate. I agree as well. And there are notions of cultural vouchers that become really important, right? Who is sharing the message and facilitating the conversation? It really matters who that is, and that there's a sort of both a level of trust and rigor in those conversations. So I absolutely agree with that as well. Jerome, did you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes, I think that overall, when we talk about having conversations around race and making sure that everyone is included, I think that when we frame it around the fact that racism isn't a problem that we created, it's a problem that was inflicted upon us. And when we think about how do we fix that, we have to talk about how we need to allow them to have their own conversations and come back to us and say, here's the solution, here's what we have come up with in talking with our own demographic, how we're going to make sure that we are undoing the systems and generations of racism that has gone on. And yeah, I think that's really how we need to frame it in order to really make progress in solving these injustices.
Thanks. And this is a climate museum panel, and so we are getting questions about the role of museums and the arts specifically in exposing and changing the intersecting exploitation of people of color and the environment. And so one question we had is, are there any excellent examples that you have seen of this type of work? And specifically, in thinking about the poetry that really set the mood and tone and captured our feelings so well at the beginning of this conversation, how do we see poetry as a medium functioning in this moment, as an interlocutor or a transmitting medium at the intersection of so many issues? What do you think? All right, ask Kate to give some just initial thoughts, given that you're recognizing that scientists aren't the only ones that have a view on climate. What do you think about this? And then Anna-Maria, I see that you've also have some thoughts.
I love it. I think poets, and artists, and storytellers absolutely have a really crucial role to play here. One of the things that's been the rudest awakening for me as a scientist is that being clearly factually correct about something is never enough to change people's minds. And I know every other scientist, every other historian, every other student of anything is going to say, well, duh, like, why didn't you know that already? But it is something that I found really, really hard and frustrating. People don't change their minds because you show them a graph. People certainly don't change their minds because you show them an equation. People change their minds because they're moved. People change their minds because they feel included. People change their minds because they see a vision of a future that they want. And as scientists, we're maybe not the best at creating that vision of a future. And I think that's where poetry, that's where the arts, that's where these things can come in and help us conceive of the future that we want together.
Excellent, thank you. Anna Maria, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with Kate completely that artists of many crafts are uniquely able to call from people their sense of imagination, their sense of connection to each other, their sense of purpose, and that is so necessary in a moment when we are demanding not just tinkerings at the edges of our reality right now, but actually profound transformation. Our ability to stem the climate crisis that is upon us, our ability to end the profound ways in which racism shapes everyone, like every aspect of people's lives, requires that we live with a sense of deep connection to that idea of the world we want to live in. And poets, I mean, the way that Araceli set the tone for this conversation is a perfect example. I haven't heard a better description of what people are calling the care economy than Araceli's poems. About how we build the world we want, rooted in a desire to care for one another. And so, and you know, when we look at some of the things that have been produced by, you know, in the recent weeks of uprisings and the videos that are showing up online, and the moments that are most evocative are the moments of people dancing in the streets to a particular song, and just expressing a sense of joy and freedom, and the grasping of liberation in their bodies. And that is what art allows us to do, that and that is so urgently needed right now.
I love the language of grasping liberation in our bodies, right? That's a bit of poetry that is so evocative, exactly the way you're describing. You know, we're getting a lot of questions, and all of you have touched on this. We're getting a lot of questions about, you know, how do we make sure that this moment isn't just about reform, you know, sort of atomized reform of X, Y, or Z, but really about getting to the systemic roots of the problem. There's also been a question about, you know, understanding that this political moment in terms of, you know, our election and specifically the proposals that our presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, has come out with, that are they getting where we need to go? And so that sort of, to me, allows for an important conversation about what does the world look like that we want to get to. And I don't want to sort of be utopian about, you know, provide me the technicolor example of the future, but actually specifics around this. And Jackie mentioned, for example, you know, the sort of hyper localism that is actually also able to bridge between peoples in disparate spaces. What is the in this uncommon moment, right? What is the way that we get from where we are now to where we'd like to go?
Yeah, I think that one big way that we can change the way that we're organizing now is that we can't have elections that are winner take all. We can't continue to allow people to be, you lose everything or you win everything. It needs to have ranked choice voting, where we allow people to not pit against each other just to have a seat in the House or seat in the Senate. We just need to have it where that we are working together and be collaborative in our political system, not be antagonistic. And that is very indicative of our culture, is that we're always pitting against each other, whether it's within our own party or it's in differing parties. It's very hard to even get anywhere because we're always fighting with each other and we don't have a culture of collaboration. Another thing that can be huge is that we actually prioritize what is important. Like right now, in the Black Lives Matter movement, calling for the defunding of the police, what we're talking about is defunding communities. We're trying to model communities that are in suburbs, that are in wealthy suburbs, because in wealthy suburbs, they already defunded the majority of police precincts. And in New York City, where there's a huge uptick in crime, people keep saying, put more money into the police system and there'll be lower crime. But in New York, there's been a track record of more money, there's been more uptick in crime. They now have a $6 billion budget for the police, but also at the same time, they have a $2 billion deficit for public school systems. So that's what we're talking about, is allocating resources to communities to areas of communities that need it. We need to have more social workers to prevent violent crimes. We need more investment in our communities so that there isn't a school to prison pipeline. That's what we're talking about, is pushing for our future, is also having bold leadership and have the moral courage to talk about climate change at the scale, scope, and speed that it is, and actually put up these resolutions and put up bills that actually substantize the Green New Deal, and not just have the resolution of the Green New Deal be something that we aspire to, like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, something that we aspire to be, but actually something that we're taking necessary steps forward, like the Green New Deal for public housing or the Climate Change Education Act. These bills, or the National Climate Bank Act, all these bills are making sure that climate change is actually being tackled and not just talked about, and just being lip service to politicians to be able to be reelected. That's something that we have. These are some of the steps that we can take. And one of the biggest things that anyone can do watching this right now is call a member of Congress. Just talk to them, tell them, say, hey, this bill you need to co-sponsor. This bill that I've just researched on, the Climate Change Education Act, which will require climate education to be a core subject in all schools across America, to be a thing. And I used to intern for Congressman John Lewis, and I used to have to tally every time someone talked about a specific issue. And if you send something in the mail, if you email us, if you do anything else, I don't tally it. And what happens is if you have 20 people on this call right now, call a member of Congress, that will impact that member's actions for the next week. And that can profoundly change our politics for the next week. And we continue to do that over and over again. We'll have a systemic revitalization of our politics. And if the politicians can't handle the mass influx of calls, then they'll see this job isn't for me. Public servant, serving the public isn't for me. I'm just interested in power. That's something that would change our system of governance. And that's something that's really easy. Take 5 to 10 minutes, call them, get to know them, and you can really make a huge impact just from being on the inside. I know it seems trivial, but it's huge.
No, thank you, Jerome. That's excellent, and actually helps us see how individual actions sort of trickle up to that systemic level that you're describing, right? Which is, there was so much in what you said, but a lot of what we can take from that is that there's so much that we can do to actually make sure it's not just a cosmetic reform, but sort of deeply transformational systemic reform that we can seek. Did you have thoughts on the arts and museum question that was raised earlier? I just wanted to make sure that you have an opportunity to share a bit of that as well.
Yeah, I really want to talk about that, because before I was an environmental activist, formerly like organizing marches and things like this, I worked in making poetry and also building virtuality environments to tell the story of climate change through the arts. And I told the story of a 5-year-old migrant traveling from Guatemala to southern Texas, and you'd be in this experience. I think that storytelling in art is extremely powerful when you can't get real policy done because no one understands it. Like so many people in the 70s and 80s didn't really understand climate change because it was scientific, but it wasn't cultural. It wasn't down to earth in the way that we can understand it just in bite sizes. And I think that is like really important because art is so critical right now, because in marches, we're seeing that all these street art, all this chalk, all these different ways that we're expressing ourselves is encouraging people and inspiring young people like myself just by seeing art and by seeing this happen like that. That's amazing, because that inspired me to become a virtuality developer, and then seeing more art made me become an activist. And it inspires people. Like artists are the real movement makers. They're the people who provoke society to move forward. So yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. Jackie, can I ask you to say a little bit more about, there are questions actually, people want to hear more about your, what you're describing in terms of regenerative economies, looking at how that, you know, again, that builds from the local to sort of global movements. We also had a question about globalizing justice. And so I just wanted to have you say a little bit more about what you're envisioning with the specifics of how we understand the world that we'd like to see coming to be.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, there's so much with that. So one piece of work that we are working on now is this notion of transformational climate finance, because we know that we need to get money out of politics. We need campaign finance reform and de-link our economic system with our political system, so that it really is, you know, that each vote matters, and that we have true democracy. And with that, so both in terms of campaign finance reform and certainly in terms of reversing Citizens United, get money out of both politics and out of our courts. And so, and with that, we as it relates to our economic system and shifting our economic system. Right now, as we know, this kind of profits over people is exactly, and it's profits over planet as well, is where we've gotten to where we are now. The extractive relationship with people and the extractive relationship with natural resources and the lack of harmony with both. And so at the local level and otherwise, developing not only regenerative economies, but having regenerative design to our society, so that we are actually to our infrastructure and so forth, so that we actually are thinking of ways that we are in harmony with nature and in harmony with each other by design, whether it's how our lived environment is designed and how our systems are designed. It all needs to be in that same vein and set of values. So as an example, we are working on not whether it's co-op models or whether it is models around municipal ownership versus private ownership of various systems. So certainly pushing back on whether it's prison privatization, water privatization, all the different ways that people are people's well-being and lives are devalued, and the well-being of a wealthy few is the way our systems are structured, is what we need to shift away from. So when we see systems now where we have, whether it's groups like For the Love of Water that are pushing for community control of water, so that the value is everyone having access to drinkable, affordable water. As I said before, in terms of local food systems, whether it's Soul Fire Farms or the Black Urban Growers Network or the Earthseed Institute, where the value is access for all to healthy, nutritious foods. And we're moving away from trucking or shipping foods that puts greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere and feeds the beast of big ag, as opposed to feeding our bellies in a way that's actually sustaining. How we generate energy, moving away from something that's belching out toxins in our environment, or putting spent fuel rods into our earth. All of these are against the regenerative design of society, as opposed to actually being in harmony with the wind and the sun, that are, you know, natural resources that can be engaged in a non-extractive way to generate our energy. So each and one of these systems, I mean, the world as we know is divinely designed in a way that there's abundance for all, if we just develop systems to mimic that whether it's our economic systems, our political systems, and our systems to have all the commons for the well-being of all. So that's, you know, very kind of a big picture, but the details are in all of these great local projects where they're already doing it. The regenerative energy systems, regenerative water systems, and regenerative food systems, and so forth and so on.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I want to ask Kate if you have any thoughts on this specifically, because when we think about the extractive nature of our economy, as Jackie was describing, there is a sort of there's an element of this that is, again, is global, that is disproportionately impacting Black and brown people around the globe. It's really difficult to say model in climate science data in terms of thinking about what our practice is today, the impact it truly has on the global climate and global relationships to justice. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how we push through that and achieve this sort of this world that's more based on regenerative economies and justice itself.
Yeah. So, you know, as a climate modeler, if I want to change the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, I just go into the model run deck and I change one number. And that's really easy to do. But that's not how carbon dioxide concentrations got changed in the real world. We know that carbon dioxide concentrations, which are about 415, 410 right now, parts per million, that got changed because people made decisions, and those decisions are really rooted in particular historical contexts and who got to make what choices and existing power structures and power dynamics. And those are really, really difficult to put into a climate model. But I've been really inspired by some of my friend Mary Heglar's writing on this, because as a scientist, I really get annoyed by denial. I think you don't get to deny things just because they're inconvenient. You don't get to deny things just because you don't understand them. And you don't get to deny things just because your skill set doesn't allow you to immediately work with them. And I think denying the historical context that has led to elevated carbon dioxide conditions, denying the choices and who has been making the choices, colonialism, racism, the extractive economy, capitalism, denying the role of those things is just as wrong as denying that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So I don't have the answers right now. I don't know how to do this, but I think it's going to require a lot of humility on the part of scientists. And I think that's really difficult in a sense because we have been kind of under attack for so long. We've been so used to being the one saying, no, stop the denial. We are right here. And giving ourselves the space to say, there are things that we don't understand. You understand these things. You have done the work. You have done the research. Can you help us? I'm really interested in creating that space for those conversations to happen. I think we need to do that.
Well, quick follow-up, Kate, because it sounds like the job is at least 50% difficult conversations, right? Whether it's dealing with denial externally or internally in terms of shifting the discussion within the climate science community. There's a specific question in the Q&A about, from a white listener who's saying, when trying to have these conversations, as someone who's white with other white folks, there's sometimes a pushback, or there's a statement of, I don't feel comfortable talking about this when there aren't people of color around. And so he or she is looking for, or they is looking for the techniques for breaking through this initial resistance. So I don't know if you have any answers to that or any sets of recommendations and approaches.
I mean, I wouldn't claim to have any answers or any good answers. I would say what works for me personally is, okay, like it's uncomfortable. You know what's really uncomfortable is climate change. You know what's really uncomfortable is living in a society that's not a democracy. Those things are really uncomfortable. And in order to fix the things that I really care about, I think we sometimes need to decenter ourselves, right? Like we need to say, it's not about, am I a good person? It's not about, am I racist? It's not about, was that fair? Was that unfair to me personally? Because in order to have these conversations, we need to look at the facts. And the facts aren't just the physics. The facts aren't just the chemistry. The facts are the history and the current politics and the political economy. And I think just sort of focusing on the reality can really help us as white people, and I speak as an extremely awkward white person here, as awkward white people, to decenter ourselves and not make it about us.
Thank you. Other thoughts from the other panelists on this question, and also on thinking about the elements of this conversation that become about that intersectionality and allowing for that to be appreciated in a meaningful way.
Yeah, if I could go, I think that exactly what Kate was saying is that climate change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's a system that started this, and it started far before any carbon dioxide was emitted. It happened when the idea of colonialism and the idea of extraction and just taking for profit started. It started with slavery. It started with colonialism mindset, and it's that system that needs to be changed. And I think that when we have these conversations talking about how people get awkward around not having a person of color there to talk about racism, this is going to get really uncomfortable me saying this, is that say you're talking with a group of people who are rapists, and you say, we can't talk about racism. We can't talk about being rapists unless we have a rape victim here and have them tell us their story and how we can stop being rapists. That's what the cynicism is for Black people, is saying that why do I have to be in a conversation about something that I didn't even start? I don't even understand the concept of racism. How am I able to fix something that I myself am not able to even possess in my spirit? And that's something that is the mindset. So I think that when we talk about this, we have to talk about the fact that this is something that needs to be changed from within. And also talking about the fact that this is inherently intersectional. There's no movement that's not intersectional with climate change. There's no movement that's not intersectional with racial justice, because racism has been at the heart of all of our societal hierarchy, whether that's in South America or whether that's in India or whether that's in Asia or anywhere. People still in Asia are still bleaching their skin because they see light skin as being the norm. And it's insane, because we can't live in silos anymore. We can't silo ourselves off, because that's how they took over in the first place, divide and conquer. We have to unite and mobilize in order to overcome that. And the only way to fight the well-oiled machine of racism and colonialism is with the movement. And that's what's happening now. And we need to continue that movement, whether you're cognizant of bias or cognizant of our internalized racism. It doesn't matter. We're here now, you're here, and this is the first step. We're glad that you're here and listening to us and listening to this conversation. And the next step is just to continue talking with small groups or with your family or your friends, to continue to normalize the conversation around racism. Because in South America, the conversation around racism is very different. It's very relaxed. It's very, we can talk about this because we've overcome. But in America, we haven't overcome yet. So it's very hard to talk about these things.
Thanks. Anna Maria, did you have some thoughts on this?
This question of like, where do we begin is an important question, because the kind of the challenge, that the multiple fronts of the challenge are real, and it is overwhelming, and it is totally reasonable to feel like any one person's effort is not enough, or any one conversation might not be worth it, because, you know, what's that gonna change? But I feel like we have to, this is why looking at history is helpful, because if we're able to look at some moments in history, we recognize that there are battles that like in kind of every generation has to wage some of the same battles in order to move in the direction that we aspire to. And so that means all of us are new, all of us will be at the beginning of the battle at some point, and will make as much progress as we can make in our lifetimes with the efforts that we have as like individual human beings, as community. And I think some of the principles of climate justice are helpful as we think about our own efforts. We need time to recharge. We need time to rest and fill with joy and imagination. We need time to learn from one another. We need space for community. This is where the museum, this particular community, but also other spaces of community are important. We need the humility to know that we don't have to be experts at any particular intervention to try to do what we can. And I think we're all here because we recognize that the transformation that is necessary to save our planet and to get closer to the country of our dreams is a transformation that requires all of us in some way. And I have been an organizer, primarily in the immigrant rights movement for close to 20 years. And, I helped build an organization in New York called Make the Road New York, and people would come, mostly, first generation undocumented immigrants would come with problems like, I'm not getting paid at work, or I'm getting evicted from my home, or my kid, I don't know how to navigate the school system because, and I can't help my child. And people would find other folks who had community, who had the same lived experience. No one claimed to be an expert to be able to share their story. No one claimed to be an expert to be able to understand that person's story and to give each other the level of support that they needed to solve not just the most kind of immediate pressing issue in their life, but to engage in thinking about how to fight for all of us for more. And and so I feel like the space for accepting that we have to learn and that we both can contribute our own stories, but also our willingness to transform our lives, ourselves, our mind, and learn is important. And then understanding that the potential for transformation actually lives in the people that are new, the ones that are showing up for the first time. The beauty of the uprisings right now is made up of all these people who never claim to be experts, who are just showing up and demanding what they want, not what is possible, not what the budget, not what the mayor said was, passable in the next budget, but what they want. And that energy is essential. I learned this lesson very much as an experienced organizer. I learned it again when we were fighting, my organization was fighting the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. And even though I helped organize the protest and all of it, the moment that taught me the most was I happened to be one of the women that confronted Senator Flake in the elevator, but the woman that was next to me was actually showing up for the first time. And she was the one that said to Senator Flake, look at me when I'm talking to you, tell me that what happened to me doesn't matter. And it is that demand from communities across the country, communities who are living with pollution, communities who are living with state violence, communities who are about to lose their homes because there has been no cancellation of rent in these months and months of economic shutdown. That demand, look at me and tell me that what happened to me doesn't matter, is at the essence of where we start. And then we go from there. And the conversation sometimes will be choppy and uncomfortable, and sometimes will be beautiful. Sometimes they will be very beautiful.
That's right. Thank you, Ana Maria, because those that are showing up, right, become a huge part of seeing the sort of the size of the dialogue that you're describing, right? Our ancestors have been in this dialogue in some form over so much time. And what's amazing about this moment is that the new faces that you're describing are really undeniable. This actually relates to a specific question we have from one of the audience members. The audience member is asking if you can talk more about the public side of the movement we're seeing right now. People say that protests don't accomplish anything, but I don't think that's true. How do you talk about the importance of community and empathy in tackling all of this? So, other thoughts on this? What's your sense of the public side of the movement we're seeing right now? Questions of empathy. Jackie, Kate, Jerome?
I think one very moving thing about the public side of the movement is the storytelling that comes out of activism. So and storytelling, just as we talked about with culture work, and it's really in some ways an aspect of culture work, is such a moving, because whether people are seeing themselves in a story or seeing their experience in someone else's story, or just feeling that connection and that humanity, it becomes not just an issue on paper, it becomes a lived reality when people are out there talking about these issues and what drives them to engage around these challenges. So I think the visibilizing of people and visibilizing of people's stories and experiences, and the connection that we experience through that moves people, and it changes things. But just even going back to that question around use of culture, whenever I'm doing a public talk, I always include a few snips of videos, and one of the ones that I include is a person who, it's a combination of someone using engaging spoken word, and then there's also a dance performance where someone is really through movement expressing the experience around pollution in their community, and in the background, this person is weaving the narrative around the connection between pollution and the well-being of kids, and the fact that people don't feel valued in their communities, and even talking about the political system. And the person says it in such a compelling way that my talk that I give around it tends to be kind of like the Charlie Brown voice, but everyone remembers that video and that spoken word artist who told those stories and in that touching way. So I do think that the public nature of storytelling is one of the critical aspects, and how people connect to that.
Thank you. So this time is different. Yes, so we're sort of all agreed on that one. One of the questions that we have here is also about how to balance that and sustain that movement, especially with the amount of money that is required in making the change, but also that's behind a lot of the status quo right now. Do you have any thoughts about that? I saw some chatter about Citizens United and these other sort of structural pieces. Are there other elements of this that you'd like us to be aware of, and from the vantage point of your work?
I'm sorry, I'm a little confused about the question. Could you reframe it a little bit, or restate it?
Sure. There was a question about what is economically viable as well, and questions around economy and how they get sort of pitted against even human well-being, right? I mean, human well-being and economy and environment, those uncomfortable dichotomies that are set up, and how we sort of bridge that. Have you thoughts on that, Jerome?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do. So like, I think that when we talk about the economy and we talk about all these things, I spent my last summer at Harvard University really taking a class about this. So it's like really in my wheelhouse. Just talking about how we need to incorporate natural resources into our GDP. My research study was called the Human Right to Natural Capital. And I think I said this before, but I think I give the analogy of a tree. I talk about how a tree grows and grows, and our economy is focused on limitless growth. And no matter what, the economy must grow and grow. But in nature, there's nothing that grows infinitely. What happens is they have a growth part, and they have a growth segment, and then they have a development segment, where they go back and look at their growth and say, was my growth evenly distributed throughout my roots and my leaves? And was it equitably given out? Like, where is the water needed? Where is the nutrients needed? And I think that's what the next step is needed in our economic system, is to allocate resources to second and third world communities to make sure that they are given the amount of resources and the amount of attention given to them from the things that have been taken away. And I think that our economy must reflect our values, and it can't just be something from a talking standpoint, but from something that we remodel our GDP to allocate for the forests and the things that we value. Like currently our economic system, we value a new car that's in 2019 or 2020 more than we value a tree or a forest. And that's something that needs to be reflected in our economic system, to say that a tree gives us life, a car is luxury. So a tree should be something that's the baseline of our economic system to give value to that, so that you can't just cut down trees limitlessly and cheaply and say that that's just something that can just be exported. But we need to make sure that trees have that value economically, and not just something that's sentimental and that's cultural, something that's actually hard driven into our economic model. Because the only sphere of the world that's allowed to live outside the moral bounds of society is our economic system. And they don't care at all about any devastation to community or culture, but just the allocation of capital and the more aggregate of capital just in one place. And that's not what nature is like at all.
Thanks, Jerome. Other thoughts on that question from the panelists? Well, so, as we're thinking ahead and have sort of painted somewhat of a picture of the world as we'd like to see it, and specifically how we get there, oftentimes conversations around climate close with this question around hope, right? Do you have hope? And where do you derive that hope from? But I want to credit Kate with this important sort of change in that question, a critical shift in what we're thinking about. And that is, do we collectively have courage? Do we have the courage to do what we need to do to get to where we're going? And as we've discussed, courage is going to be an indispensable part of moving from where we are now, how we got here, and really taking this incredible moment as an opportunity to build anew. So the question that I have for each of you, that I'd like each of the panelists to answer is, what would an act of courage look like in your position of access or in position of activism or engagement? How does that work specifically for you? I'm gonna have us start with Anne-Maria again.
So the thing about courage is that it's not a limited resource. It actually is something that gets generated through experience. And I think that, protest actually is a massive planting of seeds of courage that then become what they have to become over the course of years and years. So these moments, and not just these specific moments of the uprisings right now, but the kind of the period that we have been living in over the last several years of very powerful protest, as I think are like an essential resource for building the country that we want. And they are essential for the kind of transformation that is required of our democracy. We are about to see, perhaps, and I know we say this about every election, but we're about to have, I believe, really the most consequential election of our lifetimes. And it will require of all of us to give more than we have given, of our time, our energy, the willingness to take a risk. And do something that might be super uncomfortable, like calling strangers, knocking on doors, donating, whatever that is, being in community with people. But I think that the harvest of the protest will be essential for that moment, as will the lessons that I think we are learning about, from the COVID crisis. For example, we are learning that in order to stem a crisis, we have to give things up. We have to pause. We have to allow space for healing. We have to, and that will be necessary to stem the climate crisis. And that will be necessary to transform the racist roots of the society, giving up power, giving up status, giving space, creating space, giving more, like allowing for like higher taxation of people who have more, giving up control. Those who have control over our democracy, like, are gonna have, if they are serious about ending the climate crisis, are gonna have to pay more taxes, and are gonna have to be willing to stop the role that, like, the massive, just like predication of growth, like Jerome was describing, are gonna have to actually abide by values that are more rooted in like the natural ecosystem. And I think all of that, the combination of all of these things, require all of us to ask ourselves, so if I hear this voice in my head that says I must do something, listen to that voice today and do that something that might be deeply uncomfortable and require some courage that you didn't know you had, but you do have.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much. Kate, what's your take on this moment and an act of courage in your space?
I think a lot about a feeling. And if you've ever had something really terrible happen to you, maybe you've lost somebody you love unexpectedly, or you've been in a car crash, or just something really terrible and traumatic has happened to you. I find in the instances when that's happened to me, I think I would give anything to go back in time and prevent this from happening. I would do whatever it would take. And I think a lot about how we're kind of in that situation right now with respect to climate change. There's an artist called Justin Bryce Varelia, who is a great artist. I love his work, but he gave me a pin that says, "We are the asteroid." And that's really powerful, but it's also not true, because we are not an asteroid. We have choices and we can do something about this. And so for me, that is a framework and sort of just a mental state that's a lot more motivating than something like hope. As far as an individual act of courage in my space, I think something that I've been struggling with, and something that I think the scientific community has been struggling with, is kind of rethinking this notion of objectivity, rethinking this notion of what it means to be scientifically objective. And I know this is a conversation that's happening in the journalistic community as well right now, because for so long, we've been able in some spaces to maintain this fiction that science is somehow apolitical, that science exists outside of our political debates of the day. And that's not true. That's only true if science is 100% populated by people who are immune to politics. And being apolitical, being objective, is in a sense the same as saying, I support the status quo. I'm fine with things the way they are. And understanding that, and understanding the ways in which science, which I love, has been complicit in furthering that narrative, I think that's really, really important. And that's something that's really, really hard. And standing up and saying these things can meet a lot of resistance in the scientific community, because this is something that we really cherish, we really value. Because if we're just part of politics, if we're political like everybody else, if we have to make value judgments, then what makes us better than anybody else? And I think the answer is we're not better than anybody else. We have some knowledge, we have studied things. I know statistics, I will talk your ear off about physics. And that's useful, but that doesn't make me better than anybody else. And I think that's something that is a hard conversation, but important to realize going forward.
Thank you. Excellent. Jackie, so we're talking about hope versus courage, and it can certainly be a healthy combination of both.
Indeed,
but what is the act of courage that, from your vantage point, and recognizing, frankly, that, you know, as Black people today, courage is getting up, getting out of the door, and having faith that you'll make it home at night, right? So I just want to acknowledge that this is above and beyond what we need to do on a day-to-day. But tell me what your thoughts are about how we change this from do we individually have hope to how do we have courage? Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of there's a leader in Jamaican history called, for people who don't know, called Marcus Messiah Garvey, and he had this notion of the Black Star Liner, which was a ship that would take folks back to Africa to really reclaim life and legacy the way he envisioned that it should be, and the life, legacy, family, and so forth. And he coined this phrase that Bob Marley then made popular in a song called, where he said, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our minds." And I posted that on Facebook in response to when we were on a town hall, and I posted it in the chat, and someone was concerned that it was kind of smacking of this bootstrap mentality, kind of indicating that we're only holding ourselves back. And I was saying kind of more of what I was saying earlier, that no, it's more about us really having a vision and demanding what we want, as opposed to just what we've barely been able to eke by in survival, as you said. Just, leaving the house in the morning and coming back in the evening is all that we can hope for in so many ways. But and what gives me hope is that folks are thinking beyond that, really thinking about a vision of what we want instead of just survival. Really focusing on the possibilities and not just the frames and the boxes that we've been put in. So that gives me hope. Like as we said, whether it's re-envisioning community safety, re-envisioning how we do energy, re-envisioning how we do our very democracy, and then actualizing. So moving from vision to action. And we've already started to see it happen, and it gives me hope that we can take it to scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Jerome, that's having expressed acts of courage again for the majority of your life. What are your thoughts in this moment and moving forward?
Yeah, I think that being a young person and being Black in the environmental movement, I think especially being a young person, I get the question of hope every single time I do it, anything. Like every time someone's like, what are you hopeful for? And my answer has evolved so much over the years. And my answer now is we've had hope. Our hope was government. Our hope was everybody else, but now it's like we're the last line. Like we're the last line of defense. Like we're young people who are in school, and then we had to take out of school just to go and protest. So I think the courage was to be selfless, and I think that's a big issue in activism, is that you have to be selfless in order to be in this movement, and nothing is about you. Nothing is about just myself being an activist, because it's not. It's about the community. You yourself are taking on the mantle of a movement, and you're organizing with others. You have to have that courage to say, this isn't about me. This is about all of us. And you also have to have the courage to change. You have to have the courage to not be complicit in just everything and just accept injustice. We can never just be complicit and say, this is our status quo, this is this is however far we're gonna get. We can't get any further. And we have to have the courage to say that, no, I'm not accepting this anymore. I'm gonna continue to strive forward for more justice and continue to fight, because we can't stop fighting. As this moment when we stop fighting is the moment we'll never get justice. And I think that's what courage is continuing to never accept the status quo and continuing to only accept when we reach our goals. And we can't sugarcoat it. We can't do anything about it. We have to just fight. We have to continue to organize and rally and organize together with everyone, every demographic, because this is affecting everyone. Yeah, and hope just comes from action. Hope. We don't get hope from just looking at cool movies anymore. I used to when I was a kid. I'll be like, I saw a cool movie. I'm like, I'm so hopeful for the future. And then we look in the real world. You're like, this hope comes from when we earned it. That's when we can be hopeful. And that's what I'm waiting for, is that huge step of change. When we start seeing the emissions curve tip down, not because of coronavirus, but because of our own courageous actions and our ability to hope for international collaboration, because that's what climate change is all about, is fighting nationalism and really striving for global solidarity. And that's what I'm hopeful for.
Thank you, Jerome. That's an excellent way to end our conversation. You give me hope, and your courage inspires me. I do think we're at that moment where we won't want to look back and know that we have done anything other than prevented the worst outcomes, but in fact ushered in the kinds of equity and justice and harmony that we're all seeking. I just want to express my deep gratitude to each of you for being a part of this conversation. I know it's just the beginning, and I'm incredibly excited for our next steps together. So with that, I will hand this over to Miranda.
Thank you all so much. We are at the hour. Everybody, please go out there, grow your hope, grow your courage. Don't accept artificial boundaries. Think big. Fight for the future, fight for each other. Thank you so much for joining us. Aracelis, thank you for starting us off. Felicia, thank you for keeping us organized and on time. Maxine, Jackie, Ana Maria, Kate, and Jerome, thank you all. And to everybody out there, what a fantastic chat. We will make a copy of this thread and post the parts of it that may be useful to you in the future. It was super active and we really appreciate that. Thank you for joining us.